All right, get ready to dive into the world of toxicology. We're exploring a fascinating lecture series today, and our mission is to understand the really critical role a doctor plays when someone might have been poisoned.
It's a really intriguing area, isn't it?
Absolutely. I was reading through the source material, and it's amazing how many things we encounter every day that could actually be poisonous.
Right. It's not always like some dramatic scene from a movie.
Yeah. Like, I always pictured poison as something a spy would use, but the source material makes it clear it's all about dosage
Hmm.
and the situation.
Definitely. Even things we consider beneficial can become really dangerous in the wrong amounts or if they're used in the wrong way. Think about something like alcohol.
Mhm.
Enjoyed responsibly, it's usually fine, but too much can be incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why toxicology isn't just about identifying dangerous substances, but it's also about understanding how they act in the body and how even things that we usually consider safe can become a threat.
Okay, so before we go any further, maybe we should clarify something.
Mm.
What exactly is toxicology? It feels like a really complex subject,
Well, it does involve some pretty cool science, that's for sure.
right?
Toxicology is basically the study of chemicals and things like physical agents and even biological substances and how they can affect living things. So it's about figuring out how these things get into the body, what happens once they're there,
Mhm.
and how the body tries to eliminate them, and of course, how we can treat any harmful effects they might cause.
So it's more than just a simple, don't eat that, it's poisonous kind of thing.
Yeah, a lot more to it. A good example of this is the idea of a fatal dose. And this is all about figuring out exactly how much of a substance it takes to actually cause death. And it might surprise you to learn that even things we generally think of as being safe, well, they can be fatal if you have too much.
Okay, that is making me look at my morning coffee a little differently now. So with all that said, what exactly are some examples of things that fall under the umbrella of poison? It seems like it could be almost anything.
The variety is really amazing. I mean,
Mhm.
we're talking about everything from, let's say, household cleaners to things like industrial chemicals, heavy metals, like lead or mercury,
Mm.
pesticides, plant toxins, animal venoms. Even some medications can become poisonous if they're misused.
So we really are talking about a huge range of things. And I'm assuming poisons aren't always like liquids or powders, right?
Nope, not at all. Poisons can be solids, liquids, gases, you name it. I mean, think about something like carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
It's a colorless, odorless gas, but it can be deadly. And then you have things like arsenic, which can be a powder, but it exists in other forms too. And the way that a poison enters your body really affects how it acts as well.
That's a good point.
Breathing in a gas is going to have very different consequences than
Right.
swallowing something. Right.
That makes those detective novels I love reading where poison is slipped into a drink seem a little less believable now that I
Yeah.
think about it. So we have this huge range of poisons and different ways they can get into the body. But I guess not every poisoning is intentional, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. Poisoning can happen in all kinds of situations. Accidents are really common, like when a child gets into cleaning supplies.
Right.
And of course, there are intentional poisonings, in cases of suicide or homicide. Our source material also mentions something called occupational poisoning.
Uh-huh.
And this is where people are exposed to toxins as a regular part of their jobs.
That's a really good reminder that poisons can be lurking in all kinds of places we wouldn't necessarily expect. Speaking of unexpected things, let's say someone comes into a hospital and there's some concern that maybe they've been poisoned. What would happen next? What are the next steps in a situation like that?
That's when a doctor's role becomes absolutely essential. They have this responsibility, both medically and legally, to figure out what's going on. And the source material actually walks through this with a case study of a 23-year-old girl who was found semi-conscious.
Okay, so walk me through this. What are some of the things a doctor would absolutely have to do if they thought someone might have been poisoned?
The most important thing is gathering as much information as possible. And that means taking a thorough medical history, doing a physical examination, asking about the person's symptoms. Have they been exposed to any substances? What's the timeline of everything that's happened? Do they have any pre-existing conditions? It's a bit like detective work, actually.
So the doctor's kind of piecing together all these clues to see if they point to poisoning.
Exactly. And just as important as gathering those clues is documenting them really, really carefully.
Okay.
Every single detail needs to be recorded,
Yeah.
really clearly and objectively,
Mhm.
because this information could be incredibly important if there's a legal investigation later on.
Oh, I see. So the doctor's notes aren't just for medical purposes. They could end up as evidence.
You got it. What the doctor observes could be really important in determining if the poisoning was an accident or a suicide attempt or maybe something even more serious.
Right.
And in some cases, a doctor might even need to involve the police.
I can imagine.
In a suspected homicide, that's almost always going to happen. But if it looks like a suicide attempt, things can get a little tricky legally.
Yeah, I can see that.
So the doctor really has to be careful in those situations.
So the doctor isn't just treating the patient, they could also be starting an entire investigation.
That's right. It's a complicated role that really requires a deep understanding of both medicine and, the potential legal implications of a poisoning case.
Okay, so we've talked about how a doctor might suspect poisoning, but how would they actually know for sure? I mean, it's not like poisonous substances come with a big warning label, right?
Right, right. Well, that's where the real investigation begins. Uncovering evidence of poisoning, it involves a whole multi-pronged approach. And it often starts with a really careful examination of the scene.
A scene examination, like in a TV show.
Yeah, kind of. Think of it like putting a puzzle together. Investigators will be looking for any trace of whatever poison they suspect, so things like containers, pills, or just any unusual substances. And they'll also look for signs of a struggle, especially if they think it might be a homicide.
So the environment can actually tell us a lot about what happened. But what about the person who might have been poisoned? Are there any signs on their body that could point to poisoning?
Definitely. Examining the body, just looking at it externally, can actually tell us a lot. For example, they'll look at the skin for any burns, discoloration, unusual markings that could indicate contact with a poison.
Like a chemical burn from something corrosive.
Exactly. And they'll also be paying close attention to any odors. Some poisons have very distinct smells,
Interesting.
that can linger on the breath or even on the clothing. And detecting those odors can give us clues about what type of poison might be involved.
Wow, it's amazing how these tiny details can be so important in building a case.
Yeah.
I imagine the person's clothing would be really important to examine too, wouldn't it?
Of course. Stains or any residues on clothing, well, that can also be evidence that they had contact with some poisonous substance.
So we've got the scene, we've got the external examination. What about an internal examination that probably only comes into play if the poisoning is fatal, right?
Yeah, you're right. In cases where someone has died from suspected poisoning, a post-mortem examination or an autopsy is absolutely essential.
Okay.
And forensic pathologists, they examine the internal organs for any abnormalities that could be consistent with poisoning.
So what kind of abnormalities are they looking for? How can they tell if an organ has been affected by a poison?
Well, each poison affects the body in a different way. It leaves its own unique clues, basically. For example, in a poisoning from paraquat, which is a type of herbicide, the lungs often develop a really distinct honeycomb-like appearance.
Wow, a honeycomb lung. That sounds pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
Are there other organs that would show those kinds of very specific signs?
Oh, definitely. The liver, which is responsible for filtering toxins from the blood, it often shows damage in poisoning cases. They might see things like congestion or fatty changes, or even something called necrosis, which is basically the death of liver cells.
So even though different poisons act in different ways, they leave behind these specific fingerprints that can be detected during an autopsy.
That's a great way to put it. It's a very meticulous process, but
Yeah.
those details, well, they can be the key to solving the puzzle of what happened.
Absolutely. But hold on, there's more to gathering evidence than just looking at the scene and the person.
Yeah.
What about sample collection? That must be a huge part of toxicology.
You're exactly right. Sample collection is absolutely essential in toxicological investigations
Okay.
because it allows us to do lab analysis to definitively identify and quantify the specific poison that's involved.
This is something our listeners might actually need to know about someday. I mean, if they ever found themselves in a situation where they needed to collect samples. So what are the most important things to keep in mind when you're collecting samples for this kind of analysis?
Well, the first thing is making sure you have the right kind of samples. And that depends on what poison you suspect and the situation, but it could include blood, urine, something called gastric lavage.
Gastric lavage.
Yeah, it's basically pumping the stomach or even vomit.
So if someone's recently ingested something and they're trying to get it out of their system, gastric lavage would be part of that.
Exactly. It can be really important to recover the stomach contents,
Yeah.
which might still have some of the poison in it. And you need to collect the right amount of each sample as well.
Okay.
So, for example, If you suspect poisoning, and we're not talking about alcohol here, you'd probably need around 100 milliliters of blood.
Okay.
But for alcohol analysis, 10 milliliter would be enough.
So it's not just about grabbing a sample. The type and the amount really matter.
Sure.
What about storing the samples? How do you make sure they stay viable?
Storage is really critical. You have to use clean containers, sterile if possible, and label them correctly,
Okay.
with all the patient's details, the date and time, when you collected it, and what type of sample it is. It's like creating a chain of evidence, just like you see on those crime shows.
I was just thinking that.
And then there's transportation. Ideally, the sample should be sent to the lab right away. But if there's going to be any delay, refrigerating them, or even adding specific preservatives, that can help to maintain the integrity of the samples.
So there's a whole science to making sure these samples are preserved properly. What other kind of interesting details about sample collection should our listeners know about?
Well, this might surprise you. Hair and nails can actually be used to detect chronic arsenic poisoning.
Really?
Yeah, because arsenic can build up in those tissues over time, so they can actually provide a history of exposure.
Wow, so it's like they become a timeline of the poisoning.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why maintaining a strict chain of custody is so important. From the moment a sample is collected all the way to when it's analyzed, every single step needs to be documented, accounted for. And this makes sure that the samples haven't been tampered with and that their integrity has been maintained. We hear the term chain of custody a lot, especially on TV, but why is it so crucial in a poisoning investigation?
I was wondering that myself.
Well, it all comes down to legal admissibility. A properly maintained chain of custody is what guarantees that the evidence is valid.
Okay.
So it can be used in court. If that chain of custody is broken, the evidence might be thrown out, and that could jeopardize the entire case.
So something as seemingly simple as labeling correctly and keeping good records can have huge consequences.
Absolutely. It really highlights how even the most advanced scientific analysis can be completely undermined if proper procedures aren't followed.
This is all so fascinating. And it's clear that a doctor plays a vital role in this entire process. But they're not working alone, are they?
No, not at all.
Tell me a little more about this collaboration. Who are the key players involved in figuring out what happened in a poisoning case?
Well, you always start with the police. They secure the scene, interview witnesses, collect evidence, and then you have the government analyst, who's a specialized forensic toxicologist. They're the ones who analyze the samples, to identify and quantify the poison. And of course, hospital labs play a critical role as well, running various tests from blood work to more specialized analyses.
So it's a real team effort.
It is. Each expert brings their own unique skills to the table, and it doesn't stop there either. Depending on the case, you might have other specialists involved,
Okay.
like virologists, DNA analysts, histopathologists who look at tissues under a microscope, even experts in things like ballistics or explosives if there are firearms or bombs involved.
Wow, it really does take a village to solve a poisoning case. And it highlights how important collaboration is in these investigations.
Collaboration is key. It's by bringing together all that knowledge and all those different resources that they can get a complete picture of what happened. And that's how justice is served. And it might even help prevent future poisonings from happening.
This deep dive is really making me see poisoning cases in a totally different way. It's not just about the science, it's about the investigation and the collaboration.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the pursuit of justice.
I agree. It's a fascinating area.
But we've got so much more to uncover in this toxicology deep dive. It's really incredible how much teamwork goes into a poisoning investigation. It's like all these different experts, a whole orchestra of them, working together to solve this really complex medical mystery.
I like that analogy. It really does capture how collaborative forensic science is.
Doesn't it? We've talked about how important doctors are in the beginning, recognizing that someone might have been poisoned and getting the investigation going. But their role doesn't end there, does it?
No, not at all. Besides that initial assessment and collecting those samples.
Right.
Well, doctors are also vital for providing detailed medical records and, sometimes even giving expert testimony if the case ends up in court.
So they become a key witness, kind of helping the legal system understand all those medical details.
Exactly. Their expertise helps the court understand things like the nature of the poison, how it affected the victim, and what might have caused their death if the poisoning was fatal.
So a doctor might even end up testifying.
It's possible. They really help to bridge that gap between the medical world and the legal world.
Fascinating. This deep dive is showing me just how complicated these cases can be.
Yeah.
It's more than just the science, isn't it?
No, it's not.
It's medicine and investigations and the law,
It really is this fascinating field where science and justice come together.
doesn't it? And it's so important to remember, at the heart of every one of these cases, there's a human story. Someone's life has been affected.
That's right.
A family is looking for answers.
Absolutely.
So how does the legal system actually use all the information gathered during the investigation?
Well, that's a great question. It's where science and the law intersect. All of that evidence, the investigation of the scene, medical records, the autopsy findings, the toxicology analysis,
Yeah.
it all goes into this really comprehensive report.
Okay.
And that report can be presented in court.
I can just picture it. A courtroom, the expert witness,
Right.
a seasoned toxicologist takes the stand,
Exactly.
armed with that report and years of experience.
They present their findings to the judge and jury, explaining everything in a way that everyone can understand.
Yep.
And their testimony.
Yeah.
It can actually be the deciding factor in a case. It can determine what caused the victim's death,
Wow.
who might be responsible, and ultimately what the outcome of the entire case is.
So an expert witness could really make or break a case.
It can have a huge impact. Their objective analysis of the evidence is really what helps the legal system understand the complexities of the case. And it makes sure that justice is served,
Right.
based on scientific facts and not just speculation.
This has been so eye-opening. I mean, we started by talking about poisons as something out of a spy movie.
Right.
And now we're talking about real science and these really detailed investigations and legal battles,
It's amazing how much goes into these cases.
isn't it? We've learned so much about how these investigations actually work. But I think we need to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
What about the future of toxicology?
Ah, yes.
What's some of the challenges that toxicologists are facing today? And what about new trends that are shaping the field?
Well, the field of toxicology is always evolving.
Right.
As new poisons are developed and new detection methods are created.
Mm.
And of course, as our understanding of the human body continues to grow.
So let's look ahead. What are some of those trends and challenges that are really shaping the future of toxicology?
Well, one of the biggest trends we're seeing is what we call designer drugs or new psychoactive substances.
Yeah.
And these are essentially chemically modified versions of existing drugs.
I see.
And they're created to try to get around those legal restrictions.
So it's kind of like a constant back and forth, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chemists create these new substances, and then toxicologists are trying to identify them and understand how they work.
Exactly. It's like this constant game of cat and mouse.
It does. And it's a challenge that requires toxicologists to be incredibly vigilant
It does.
and to constantly come up with new ways to stay ahead of those who are developing these substances.
Yeah. We have to stay ahead of the curve and be really innovative, developing new techniques to identify and characterize these new threats as quickly as possible.
Are there any new technologies that are being developed that might help give toxicologists an advantage?
There are. Advancements in analytical chemistry are completely revolutionizing the field.
Wow.
Techniques like high-resolution mass spectrometry, for instance, and nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, they're becoming incredibly sophisticated, allowing us to detect tiny amounts of substances with remarkable accuracy.
Those sound like some incredibly advanced tools.
They really are. And it's not just about identifying the substances either. It's also about understanding how they work in the body at a molecular level.
I see.
And that's paving the way for more targeted treatments and antidotes.
So we're not just learning what the poison is, but how it acts so we can figure out how to counteract it.
Exactly. It's a really exciting area of research. And speaking of saving lives, another really interesting trend is the rise of personalized medicine.
Personalized medicine, how does that play a role in poisoning?
Well, personalized medicine is all about tailoring treatments to an individual's specific genetic makeup and their own particular circumstances. So in the context of poisoning, what that means is that someday we might actually be able to predict how someone will react to a certain poison.
Real?
Just based on their genes.
Wow.
We might even be able to develop antidotes that are designed just for them.
That sounds incredible. It's something right out of science fiction.
It's definitely an exciting possibility, and it has the potential to really revolutionize how we treat poisoning. But, like with any new advancement, there are going to be challenges.
What are some of the challenges that toxicologists face as the field continues to grow?
One of the biggest challenges is the sheer volume of information. I mean, with big data and all these high-throughput screening techniques, we're just generating massive amounts of data in toxicology, and the challenge is really figuring out how to analyze it all effectively.
So we have all this data, But the real issue is actually making sense of it.
That's right. We need new computational tools and approaches to help us manage and analyze these huge data sets.
Right.
We have to be able to turn raw data into usable knowledge.
I can see that. It's just something data scientists in a lot of different fields are struggling with.
It is.
Not just in toxicology.
Yeah.
So we've got all these new technologies, personalized medicine, big data. How are these advancements actually affecting the role of doctors in poisoning cases?
Well, doctors need to keep up with all these new developments if they want to effectively diagnose and treat poisoning.
Right.
They need to be aware of the new poisons, the new detection methods, the new treatments. They have to keep learning and adapting.
So they really do have to be lifelong learners,
Yeah.
constantly staying up to date.
Absolutely. And the future of toxicology really depends on collaboration, between medical professionals, scientists, and legal experts.
Right.
We need to work together, share information, develop new tools, and make sure that we can get justice in these really complex cases.
This deep dive has been absolutely incredible. I mean, we started with these basic ideas about toxicology, and now we're talking about cutting-edge research.
It really has been quite a journey.
It has, and I think our listeners are really getting a new understanding of this amazing field
I hope so.
and how important it is for keeping people safe.
I agree.
But before we finish, there's one last thing I'd like to leave our listeners with. With all these advances and with all these new threats, how can we make sure that our knowledge and resources are enough to keep up?
That's a really important question.
How can we effectively address these challenges that are constantly evolving? It's something that needs our attention and our creativity and a real commitment to protecting public health. Stay curious, listeners, and we'll see you next time. It's incredible to think about how much toxicology has changed, even just in recent years. I mean, we're constantly discovering new things about poisons and how they affect us, and there are always new challenges popping up.
Absolutely. It's a field that never really sits still.
Doesn't it? And in the last part, we started talking about some of those new challenges, like designer drugs. Those sound pretty scary.
Yeah, they are a concern. Basically, they're chemically modified versions of existing drugs, so, they're designed to get around laws and regulations.
So toxicologists are constantly having to play catch up,
In a way, yeah.
trying to identify these new substances
Yeah.
and figure out what they do.
That's right. And it requires us to be really creative. We need to keep developing newer and faster techniques to identify and understand these new threats.
So what are some of those new techniques? Are there any exciting new technologies that are helping toxicologists stay one step ahead?
Oh, there are some really interesting advancements. Analytical chemistry is kind of going through a revolution right now.
Okay.
And things like high-resolution mass spectrometry and nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, they're giving us this incredible ability to detect even tiny amounts of substances, and with amazing accuracy.
So we're talking about some serious detective work at a molecular level.
We are. And the amazing thing is that these techniques aren't just helping us figure out what the poison is, they're also helping us understand how poisons actually interact with the body.
Right, at that really tiny level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which means we can start to develop much more targeted treatments and antidotes.
So it's not just about identifying the poison anymore. It's about really understanding how it works in the body so we can create better ways to treat people.
Exactly. And it's opening up all these new possibilities for research, It has so much potential to save lives.
Doesn't it? And you mentioned another trend in the last part, personalized medicine. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, personalized medicine is really exciting. It's all about tailoring treatments to each person's specific needs
Right.
based on their genes and their unique circumstances.
So in the context of poisoning, I mean, how does that actually work?
Well, imagine that someday we could actually predict how someone will react to a specific poison just by looking at their genetic makeup.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Doesn't it? We could potentially develop antidotes that are specifically designed just for them.
So treatments for poisoning could become as personalized as, I don't know, a tailored suit,
That's a great way to put it. And it could be completely revolutionary for how we approach poisoning.
couldn't it? But all of this progress, I mean, I imagine it comes with its own set of challenges.
It does. One of the biggest challenges we're facing is dealing with the sheer volume of information we're now generating.
Because of all this new technology.
Right. We have all this data, from things like big data analysis and high throughput screening techniques.
But making sense of all that data, well, that's the real challenge.
It's not enough to just collect the data. You have to be able to understand what it all means.
Exactly. We need new tools, new ways of thinking to help us analyze and interpret these huge data sets.
And turn that data into knowledge that can actually be used.
That's the key. And this isn't just a challenge for toxicology. It's something that data scientists in a lot of different fields are dealing with right now.
It's a good point. So new technologies are creating new challenges, but they're also creating these incredible new opportunities.
They are.
And all of this has to be impacting the role of doctors, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, as technology keeps advancing, doctors really need to stay on top of things. They need to be aware of the new poisons, the new ways we can detect them,
Yeah.
and of course, any new treatment options that are out there.
So it's not enough to just finish medical school. They need to keep learning throughout their entire careers.
Absolutely. And I think the most important thing to remember about the future of toxicology is that it really depends on collaboration.
Yeah.
Medical professionals, scientists, legal experts, we all need to be working together, sharing information, and coming up with creative solutions.
That's a great message to end on. We've covered so much ground in this toxicology deep dive, from the basic principles to the most recent advancements. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has, and I hope we've been able to give our listeners a new appreciation for this complex and really vital field.
I think we have. It's been so interesting to explore all these different angles,
Mhm.
the science, the investigations, the legal side of things.
Mhm.
And I think it's clear that toxicology plays such a crucial role in protecting public health.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing their knowledge and insights with us.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, as always, keep those minds curious, and we'll see you next time.